In the bloody annals of ancient history, few names shine with such brilliance and end in such horror as that of Marcus Atilius Regulus. Born around 307 BC into the stern traditions of the Roman aristocracy, Regulus was raised in a world where courage, discipline, and duty were not lofty ideals, but the very lifeblood of the Republic. These virtues, unyielding courage in the face of death, relentless self-control, and an uncompromising devotion to the state, were etched into him from childhood, and they would shape not only his rise to power, but also his ghastly fall into one of the most terrifying deaths ever recorded in antiquity. Rome in the 3rd century BC was no longer a fragile city-state struggling for survival. It was an empire in the making, hungry and relentless, clawing its way across the Italian peninsula and now casting its eyes upon the Mediterranean. And standing in its path was Carthage, wealthy, cunning, and unchallenged upon the seas. Inevitably, the ambitions of these two titans clashed, sparking the First Punic War, a brutal struggle that would drag on for more than 2 decades, leaving the Mediterranean soaked in blood. It was into this cauldron of conflict that Regulus stepped. To the Senate, he was the perfect embodiment of Roman virtue. To his soldiers, he was a leader whose presence on the battlefield inspired unwavering loyalty. His name became synonymous with victory, and yet, fate, so often cruel in the ancient world, was already sharpening the knife that would one day carve him into legend. For in Rome, duty was not a word spoken lightly. It was sacred. To betray one's oath, to flinch before one's responsibility, was to offend not only the Republic but the gods themselves. Regulus understood this with every fiber of his being. He would obey his orders, lead his men, and uphold Rome's honor, even if it meant marching directly into the abyss. And so his story begins not as that of a victim, but of a hero. A consul of Rome who dared to carry the war into the heart of Africa itself, a commander who would stand defiant before Rome's greatest enemy. Yet history is cruel, and the same virtues that lifted him to glory would soon chain him to his doom. For Marcus Atilius Regulus was destined not only to conquer, but to suffer. And his suffering would echo through the centuries as one of the most horrifying spectacles of vengeance ever devised by man, death, not by sword or spear, but by the slow and merciless agony of boiling oil. By the 3rd century BC, Rome was no longer the fragile city-state it had once been. What began as a modest settlement on the banks of the Tiber had transformed into a relentless war machine. The legions had marched from the Apennines to the southern seas, conquering tribes, crushing rivals, and binding all of Italy beneath Rome's iron will. Yet conquest, once tasted, is never easily relinquished. Rome's eyes turned outward, toward the glittering prize of the Mediterranean. But one power stood in its way, Carthage. Carthage was no ordinary rival. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers, it had risen into a wealthy empire built upon commerce, cunning, and naval supremacy. Its harbors overflowed with ships, its markets with spices, ivory, and gold. Carthage was rich, disciplined, and unafraid of war when profit was at stake. If Rome represented the iron of land-based conquest, Carthage embodied the wealth and reach of the sea. Their collision was not just inevitable. It was destined to reshape the ancient world. The spark ignited in 264 BC, over a patch of land that seemed insignificant at first, Sicily. To Rome, Sicily was a stepping stone, a fertile island within reach of the legions. To Carthage, it was the linchpin of trade and naval dominance. Neither side would yield. And so began the First Punic War, a war that would consume 23 years, drain unimaginable treasure, and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. From the outset, the struggle was unlike anything the ancient world had witnessed. Rome, traditionally a land power, had almost no navy. Yet within months, Roman shipwrights hammered together fleets of triremes and quinquiremes, teaching farmers and shepherds to become sailors. Carthage laughed at first. But soon, laughter turned to rage as these improvised fleets began ramming, burning, and capturing their ships. The seas ran red, and the coasts of Sicily burned with the fires of constant siege. Cities were reduced to rubble, their citizens enslaved, their temples desecrated. What had begun as a territorial quarrel spiraled into a war of annihilation, each side determined not only to win, but to erase the other's claim to greatness. In this crucible of brutality and ambition, Marcus Atilius Regulus would rise. He was not yet the martyred legend history would remember, but already his name carried weight in the Senate and among the soldiers. Rome needed men like him, unyielding, disciplined, merciless in their devotion to victory. And Regulus would not disappoint. For as Rome sharpened its sword against Carthage, fate was sharpening its blade for him as well, preparing a destiny soaked in both glory and unspeakable torment. In 267 BC, the Roman Republic entrusted Marcus Atilius Regulus with the highest honor it could bestow, the consulship. At a time when Rome's legions were still hardening their grip across southern Italy, Regulus proved himself a master of command. His campaigns against the Salentini showcased not only his tactical brilliance but also the unyielding discipline that made him a soldier of iron. To his enemies, he was a storm, sudden, violent, and impossible to resist. To his men, he was the very embodiment of Roman virtue, fearless, uncompromising, and utterly devoted to the Republic. But history would not leave Regulus confined to the fields of Italy. Destiny was already drawing him toward a stage far greater, and far more perilous. By 256 BC, as the First Punic War dragged into its 8th relentless year, the Senate called upon Regulus once more. He was appointed consul a second time, but this time with a mission that would test the limits of Roman ambition itself. No longer would Rome bleed itself dry in endless sieges on Sicilian soil. Instead, Rome would strike at the heart of the enemy. Carthage would be invaded. The scale of the enterprise staggered even the ancients. More than 330 warships, bristling with bronze rams and crowded with legionaries, surged across the Mediterranean. Some 140,000 men rode, marched, and prepared to carve their names into history. Never before had Rome unleashed such a force beyond its own shores. And at the head of it all rode Regulus, his crimson cloak whipping in the sea wind, his face carved with grim resolve, a man who carried the weight of empire on his shoulders. To the Carthaginians watching from the African coast, the sight was apocalyptic. The horizon itself seemed consumed by wooden hulls and fluttering standards, a forest of masts piercing the sky. The sea, once their domain, was now filled with the thunder of Roman oars. Mothers clutched their children. Merchants abandoned their goods. Priests hurried to their temples, whispering desperate prayers. Carthage, for centuries the master of Mediterranean trade, had never faced such terror at its very gates. For Rome, this was more than strategy. It was spectacle, a declaration to gods and men alike that no enemy, however mighty, could stand unchallenged. Regulus embodied this audacity. Where others might have hesitated at the enormity of the gamble, he saw only duty, only destiny. He would carry the war across the sea and carve Rome's name into the soil of Africa itself. What he could not know, what no mortal could foresee, was that this very act of courage would set him on the path not only to glory, but also to torment. For in striking at Carthage, Regulus had already sealed his fate. The invasion of Africa began with triumph. Regulus, at the head of his massive armada, struck the Carthaginian coast like a thunderbolt. His legions poured ashore at Clup, a strategic stronghold, their iron shields gleaming under the harsh African sun. The Carthaginian defenders, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of Rome's advance, broke and scattered before the disciplined ranks of the legionaries. The clash was swift, brutal, and decisive. Rome had landed not only an army, but terror itself. Once a secure foothold was established, the devastation began. Roman troops swept across the countryside, looting treasures that had been gathered by Carthage over centuries of trade. Caravans of gold, ivory, and exotic goods fell into Roman hands. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep were seized, temples were stripped of their offerings, and the unlucky inhabitants, men, women, and children alike, were driven into chains. Africa's wealth was transformed into plunder, paraded before Regulus' legions as proof of their superiority. For the soldiers, it was intoxicating. After years of grueling campaigns in Sicily, slogging through endless sieges and starvation, Africa was a dream. Here was a land of plenty, its riches seemingly inexhaustible, and its people unprepared for the fury of Rome. Fires rose across the horizon as city after city fell. The once proud Carthaginian countryside now echoed with the tramp of Roman boots and the mournful cries of the conquered. But more terrifying still was the psychological blow. For generations, it had been Carthage who carried war into foreign lands, Carthage who ruled the sea and held the advantage. Now, for the first time, their citizens heard the dreadful sound of Roman war horns blaring across their own fields. To the Carthaginian mothers clutching children in darkened homes, to the priests watching helplessly as Roman soldiers smashed sacred idols, the message was unmistakable: Carthage was vulnerable, and Rome was merciless. Amid this whirlwind of conquest stood Regulus, the very image of Roman audacity. His crimson cloak flowed behind him as he rode through smoking villages, his face unflinching, his eyes fixed on the greater prize, the city of Carthage itself. To his soldiers, he was a figure of near-divine authority, a man whose leadership had turned them from weary fighters into victors drunk on glory. To his enemies, he was a specter of doom, an omen that the Republic's wrath could reach even their sacred homeland. And yet, in this blaze of triumph lay the seeds of tragedy. For Rome's victory, so swift and intoxicating, would breed arrogance. Regulus himself, blinded by success, believed the final conquest of Carthage was already within his grasp. But history would show that glory is fleeting, and that pride, in the ancient world, was often the prelude to ruin. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Rome's triumph in Africa was assured. But pride is a cruel master, and history has a way of punishing hubris. Carthage, cornered and desperate, found salvation in an unlikely figure, a Spartan general named Xanthippus. Xanthippus was a soldier forged in the harsh traditions of Sparta, a man of iron discipline and ruthless clarity. Where Carthaginian commanders had faltered, blinded by wealth and indecision, Xanthippus brought order. He studied the Roman campaigns with a cold and calculating eye. He saw the cracks that Regulus could not, an army grown complacent from easy victories, stretched too thin on foreign soil, and blind to the dangers ahead. He promised Carthage not just defense, but revenge. Under his command, the Carthaginian army transformed. Ranks of disciplined infantry drilled with renewed vigor, cavalry sharpened their tactics, and at the heart of the force stood Carthage's most terrifying weapon, war elephants. These beasts, armored and massive, were bred to trample men, horses, and hope itself beneath their crushing weight. Against them, the rigid Roman formations would be like pottery before a hammer. The fateful clash came in 255 BC, near Tunis. Regulus, unshaken and bold as ever, led his legions onto the field. His crimson cloak snapped in the wind, his voice carrying above the din, urging his soldiers to stand firm. But before them stretched a sight that chilled even the bravest Roman hearts, a wall of elephants, their tusks capped with iron, their trumpeting calls shaking the earth. Behind them, Carthaginian infantry and cavalry waited, calm and disciplined, a mirror of the Spartan order imposed by Xanthippus. The battle was chaos unleashed. Elephants thundered forward, shattering the Roman shield wall. Men screamed as they were hurled into the air, crushed underfoot, or gored upon tusks. Cavalry swept in from the flanks, cutting down those who fled. The disciplined machine that Rome prided itself on became a sea of panic and blood. And yet, in the heart of the slaughter, Regulus fought like a man possessed. His sword gleamed red with the blood of his enemies. Ancient accounts describe him striking down foe after foe, rallying fragments of his shattered army with sheer defiance. He refused to flee, refused to surrender to despair. But even legends are mortal. Surrounded, wounded, and exhausted, Regulus could fight no more. His sword fell heavy at his side, his body broken by fatigue and blood loss. The Romans were crushed. Their dreams of conquest evaporated in the African sun. And their greatest commander, Marcus Atilius Regulus, once the terror of Carthage, now stood bound in chains, a prisoner. The glory of Rome had become the humiliation of captivity. When Regulus first fell into Carthaginian hands, his captors did not rush to exact revenge. They understood his worth. This was no common prisoner of war, but a Roman consul, a man whose very name carried weight in the Senate of Rome. To kill him outright would waste a treasure far greater than gold. And so, in the beginning, they treated him with honor. Regulus was housed in relative comfort, kept not in chains but under guard. He was allowed food, clean clothing, and even the dignity of command over his own person. To the Carthaginians, he was a bargaining chip of the highest order. As long as Regulus lived, he was a card they could play in the great game of war. His captivity became a spectacle of restraint, a curious contrast to the slaughter he had once unleashed upon their homeland. Years passed in this honorable imprisonment. The war ground on, neither side able to deliver the decisive blow. Carthage, bloodied but unbroken, still held the seas. Rome, relentless and stubborn, still clung to Sicily. Stalemate consumed treasure, soldiers, and spirit. Both nations bled, yet neither bent. And within Carthage's walls, Regulus lingered like a shadow, alive, but caged, a lion behind bars. At last, Carthage grew restless. They needed a bold stroke to shift the balance. And so, a plan was born, cold, cunning, and dangerous. They would use Regulus not as a pawn, but as a messenger. He would be sent back to Rome itself, carrying their terms of peace. But there was a cruel twist. Before he departed, the Carthaginians demanded an oath, that if Regulus failed to persuade Rome to accept their conditions, he must return voluntarily to Carthage. To break such a vow was unthinkable. In the ancient world, an oath was not a mere promise, it was a sacred bond, sealed under the eyes of the gods. To betray it was to invite divine wrath, a curse upon one's name and bloodline. And so Regulus swore the oath, knowing full well what it meant. If he succeeded, Rome would yield. If he failed, he would walk back into the lion's den, offering his body once more to the mercies of his enemies. His decision was as chilling as it was noble. As he boarded the ship for Rome, the years of confinement weighed upon him, but his gaze remained unbroken. The man who had once shattered armies now carried a heavier burden, the fate of peace, and the certainty of his own doom. When Marcus Atilius Regulus returned to Rome, he was no longer the triumphant consul who had once led legions across the sea. His body was gaunt, his skin weathered by years of captivity, and yet his posture remained unbroken. The crimson cloak he wore was faded and threadbare, but it still marked him as a Roman commander. His eyes burned with the same fierce determination that had carried him through triumph and ruin alike. The city greeted him with awe and sorrow. Families pressed forward to see the man they thought long dead. His wife, Marcia, embraced him with tears, their children clinging to him as though to a ghost returned from the underworld. But even in this reunion, there lingered a shadow. Everyone knew he was bound by oath, an oath sworn not only before men, but before the gods themselves. Unless Rome surrendered to Carthage's terms, Regulus would return to his captors. When he entered the Senate chamber, silence fell. Senators who had once cheered his victories now studied his withered frame with reverence and dread. Here stood a man who had every reason to beg for peace, to plead for mercy, to cling to life. But Regulus had not come to save himself. His voice, though strained, rang with conviction. He urged Rome to reject Carthage's offer. Their terms, he declared, were nothing but slavery dressed as compromise. To accept them would be to condemn the Republic to weakness, to surrender future generations into the hands of their enemies. He painted a grim picture of what awaited if Rome bent the knee: endless tribute, humiliation, and the loss of the very virtue that made them Roman. The chamber trembled under the weight of his words. Senators shifted uneasily, their hearts torn between compassion and duty. They knew the cost of listening. To follow Regulus's advice was to consign him to a fate worse than death. But in that moment, the man who had already sacrificed everything became the living embodiment of Rome's creed, that honor and duty stood above all else, even life itself. For Regulus did not plead for himself. He condemned himself. His advice was his death sentence, spoken with full knowledge of the torment awaiting him in Carthage. Yet his gaze never wavered. His words became a weapon sharper than any sword, a call to defiance that echoed through the marble halls of the Senate. And when he finished, all knew the truth: Marcus Atilius Regulus had chosen not survival, but immortality. The Senate wavered. Many argued that Rome could not afford to lose Regulus, that one man, whose wisdom and courage had already shaped the destiny of the Republic, was too valuable to surrender. Some urged that honor could be bent, that oaths made under duress could be broken without offense to the gods. But Regulus himself silenced them. His voice, calm but unyielding, declared that an oath sworn before the divine could not be betrayed. To break faith, even with an enemy, was to stain Rome's soul forever. And so the matter was decided, not by the Senate, but by Regulus. When the day of departure came, Rome gathered in hushed disbelief. Citizens lined the streets, staring at the man who willingly walked back into the jaws of death. Mothers whispered his name to their children. Veterans saluted with tears burning in their eyes. He was gaunt, worn from years of captivity, yet he carried himself like a conqueror. His crimson cloak, though faded and tattered, caught the light of the setting sun, a banner of defiance against fate itself. The farewell at his home was agony. His wife Marcia clung to him, her face streaked with tears, her hands grasping desperately as though to hold him back from doom. Their children wrapped themselves around his legs, begging him not to go. But Regulus gently pulled them close, pressing his lips to their foreheads. His words were quiet, but his meaning thundered: Rome must live, even if he must die. The procession to the harbor was like a funeral before the death. Crowds followed in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the ancient streets. Torches flickered along the Via Sacra, casting long, ghostly shadows on marble walls. At every corner, people wept openly, yet none dared to speak against his resolve. For all knew that to challenge Regulus was to challenge the very spirit of Rome. At the harbor, he turned once more to gaze upon his city. The city he had fought for, the city he would never see again. His eyes lingered not on the walls or temples, but on the faces of his people, etched with grief and pride. Then, without a word, he boarded the waiting ship. As the sails caught the wind and Rome's coastline slipped into the distance, a chilling truth settled upon all who had witnessed his departure: Marcus Atilius Regulus was not returning to Carthage as a man, but as a sacrifice. His body belonged to the enemy, but his spirit, unyielding, incorruptible, already belonged to eternity. Carthage did not kill Regulus at once. Death, swift and merciful, was not their design. They needed something more, something calculated, deliberate, and terrifying. Regulus was to be made not merely a prisoner, but a spectacle, a tool of propaganda. His suffering would become a message carved into flesh, a warning to Rome, and a grim theater for Carthage's own citizens. The torment began subtly, but it was unrelenting. Guards denied him the simplest human need: sleep. Night after night, they filled his chamber with clanging iron, shrieking pipes, and guttural shouts. Whenever exhaustion dragged his body toward slumber, fresh noise tore it away. His mind frayed at the edges, each moment stretched into eternity, each heartbeat a drumbeat of despair. When his will still refused to break, they turned to light. Harsh, blazing lamps were fixed upon him, their flames unshielded. The glare seared into his eyes until they watered and burned. Day bled into night with no relief, only the endless assault of brightness. Slowly, Regulus's vision blurred. The world faded into blinding pain, and the creeping terror of approaching blindness became his constant companion. Still, he endured. Frustrated, his captors devised something darker. A wooden box, narrow and cruel, its interior lined with iron spikes. He was forced inside, his body pressed against the jagged points. Each breath, each twitch of muscle drove the metal deeper into his flesh. Blood trickled down his sides, his skin punctured in dozens of places. Yet Regulus remained upright, a gaunt silhouette of defiance in a coffin of torment. Day after day, they watched for him to beg, to plead, to collapse into madness. But no such weakness came. His lips never formed words of surrender. His eyes, though clouded, still carried the faint fire of resolve. Even in agony, he denied them the satisfaction of victory. The Carthaginians, both awed and enraged, whispered among themselves. This Roman was no man, they said, but a phantom, a spirit of iron wrapped in dying flesh. His tormentors, unable to shatter his will, came to a grim conclusion: if pain could not break Regulus, then his death must. And not just any death, but one so monstrous it would echo across generations. Thus, the decision was made. The final vengeance would not be silent nor swift, but a horror staged before a crowd. Regulus, the Lion of Rome, would be destroyed in body, but never, they realized, in spirit. The stage for his execution was set. The day of execution arrived, and Carthage staged it as a spectacle. A wooden scaffold was raised in the square, and at its center loomed a monstrous cauldron filled with oil, suspended above roaring flames. Citizens crowded the plaza, nobles and commoners alike, their faces a mix of curiosity, dread, and bloodlust. This was not merely punishment, it was theater, vengeance crafted to terrify both Carthage's enemies and its own people. Into this inferno was led Marcus Atilius Regulus. His body was wasted from years of torment, his eyes clouded, his skin torn and scarred. Yet he walked with unbroken pride, his head high, his crimson cloak trailing in tatters. Shackled and gaunt, he appeared more ghost than man, and yet the defiance in his bearing silenced even his enemies. To the crowd, he was a prisoner. To Rome, he would forever be a martyr. The executioners forced him forward, their iron spears pressing against his back. He did not struggle. He did not plead. His silence was louder than any cry, and it unsettled those who expected him to beg for life. When at last they raised him above the boiling cauldron, the air thickened with dread. The roar of the fire, the bubbling of the oil, the heavy stench of smoke, all merged into a nightmare symphony. Then came the moment. His foot, forced downward, broke the surface of the cauldron. The hiss was instantaneous, the flesh searing in contact with the oil. Regulus, for the first and only time, let out a cry of pain, raw, human, uncontainable. The crowd, expecting cheers, instead fell into stunned silence. Mothers clutched their children. Even hardened soldiers swallowed hard at the sight. The oil clung to him, eating away at skin and muscle, layer by layer. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh, so thick and foul that even the most bloodthirsty covered their mouths. The sound of crackling fire and sizzling flesh echoed through the square, a sound no one would ever forget. At last, his body could endure no more. He sagged forward, swallowed by the cauldron, his broken frame consumed in smoke and flame. But his spirit was not destroyed. For even in death, Regulus remained what he had always been, the embodiment of Roman honor, a man who placed duty above life itself. Carthage had killed his body. But in that moment, they had given Rome a legend. Across the Mediterranean, his name became a rallying cry, a symbol of unbreakable loyalty and eternal sacrifice. Marcus Atilius Regulus had perished in agony, but in doing so, he achieved immortality.